Do you believe in Jesus? If you believe and have faith, then I will tell you a story that will make you believe in Jesus and the spiritual mysteries that all people in the world do and believe in. Sarah woke up in the middle of the quiet night, sweat running down her forehead. The clock on the bedside table glowed faintly, the hands marking exactly 3 a.m. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a strange feeling like someone had just whispered her name in the dark. She sat up, pulling the blanket up to her chest, listening. There was nothing but the soft wind whistling through the window crack and the steady rhythm of her own breath. But deep in her soul, she knew this was not an ordinary night. Sarah was not a religious person. She grew up in a family that occasionally went to church on holidays, but faith to her was like an old coat hanging in the closet, familiar, but rarely worn. Lately, her life had been a series of failures, losing her job at the grocery store after 5 years of work, arguing with her mother over money, and strange dreams that left her exhausted every morning. But tonight, something was different. She couldn't explain it. She just felt a strong urge. Pray. She laughed quietly, saying to herself, "Am I crazy? Pray. To whom?" But the thought wouldn't go away. It clung to her like an old song echoing in her mind. Finally, unable to bear the heavy silence, Sarah got out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. She knelt awkwardly, clasped her hands together, and whispered, "God, if you're really there, I don't know what to say, I just need help." There was no thunder or blinding light in response. But in that moment, Sarah felt a strange peace creep into her heart. She didn't know it, but from this moment on, her life would change forever. The next morning, Sarah trudged to the small church at the end of the street. She didn't intend to attend Mass, she just wanted to find a quiet place to think. In a dusty corner of the old library, she found a worn leather notebook titled, "The Fourth Hour, the Moment of Power." Curious, she opened it to read. The scribbled handwriting told of a time between 3 o'clock and 5 a.m., called the fourth hour, when the spiritual world was most active. "This is when the enemy spreads darkness," the book wrote, "but it is also when the prayers of the faithful can pierce the night and bring light." Sarah frowned. She didn't believe in demons or mystical stories. But something in those words made her shiver. She remembered the dream from the night before. An invisible darkness surrounding the house, whispering negative words into the ears of her and her family. She shook her head, telling herself it was just imagination. But as she left the church, the book still rested in her hands. That night, she decided to try again. The clock struck 3 a.m., and Sarah woke up, this time with a small candle lighting up the corner of the room. She read aloud a Bible verse suggested by the book. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Her voice trembled, but as she finished, she felt a cool breeze sweep through the room. It wasn't a hallucination, she was sure of it. In the days that followed, Sarah began the habit of praying during the fourth hour. At first, she stumbled, not knowing what to say other than simple words, "God, please help me." But gradually, she began to feel that something bigger was happening. The dreams became clearer. She saw her brother John, who was drowning in debt, surrounded by whispering shadows of despair. She saw her mother, always angry, imprisoned by the pain of the past. And she saw herself, weak but holding a bright sword, the prayer. One night, Sarah woke up with a heavy feeling. The air in the room was thick, as if someone was watching her. She turned on the light, but the darkness didn't seem to go away. Her heart raced as she gripped the Bible tightly and shouted, "Leave here, in the name of God." The wind that had been howling through the window suddenly stopped, and the suffocating atmosphere disappeared. Sarah trembled, but she knew she had just won an invisible battle. After 7 days of continuous prayer, a miracle happened. One morning, The phone rang and an old friend invited her to work at a newly opened store. At the same time, John called, his voice full of excitement. "Sarah, I don't know what's happening, but today I got a big contract. I might be able to pay off the debt." Sarah smiled, tears streaming down her face. She knew this wasn't a coincidence, but the journey didn't stop there. Sarah began to pray for her family, neighbors, and the small town she lived in. Her prayers spread like wildfire, rekindling faith in others. An elderly woman was healed of chronic back pain. A separated couple found love again. And Sarah, from being a skeptic, became the watchman during the 4th hour, leading the community through the dark moments. After 7 days of persistent prayer during the 4th hour, Sarah was no longer the timid woman who had once feared the dark. She felt as if a new strength was flowing through her veins, not because she was stronger, but because she believed she was no longer fighting alone. Small changes began to appear in her life. The new job at her old friend Emily's store not only helped her cover expenses, but also brought unexpected joy through meeting people. But what amazed Sarah the most was the phone call from John, her brother. "Sarah, I can't believe it," John said over the phone, his voice trembling with excitement. "Today, I signed a contract with a big construction company. They paid up front enough for me to pay off the bank debt. Can you believe it?" Sarah smiled, gripping the phone tightly. "I believe it, I really do." She didn't tell John about the nights she had knelt beside her bed, praying for him during the 4th hour, visualizing the desperate shadows disappearing from his life. She didn't need him to know, not yet, at least. What mattered was that she could feel the power of prayer, not just for herself, but for those she loved. But not everything went smoothly. When Sarah began sharing her experience with a few friends, she received skeptical looks. Emily, the store manager, laughed when she heard about the 4th hour. "Sarah, are you serious? It sounds like a fairy tale. You think praying at midnight can change anything?" Sarah blushed but didn't argue. She quietly continued, believing that time would prove her right. And time didn't disappoint her. One morning, Mrs. Martha, the 80-year-old lady who lived at the end of the street, walked into the store with her cane but with a beaming face. "Sarah, can you believe it?" she said, her voice trembling. "Last night, I prayed just like you said. During that strange hour, this morning, I woke up without back pain. It's been 20 years since I've been able to stand up straight like this." Sarah was astonished. She had mentioned the 4th hour to Mrs. Martha in passing, not expecting her to try it. The news spread quickly through the small town. Before long, a small group began gathering at Sarah's house every early morning, kneeling with her in the dim candlelight, whispering their prayers. Some prayed for health, some for peace, and some simply wanted to feel God's presence, just as Sarah had described. But as the light spread, the darkness didn't remain still. One night, while Sarah was praying, she felt an invisible pressure weighing down on her chest. The air in the room turned cold, even though the windows were closed. She opened her eyes, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow pass across the corner of the room. Her heart raced, but she remembered what the old book had said. The enemy is most active during the 4th hour, but prayer is a more powerful weapon. Sarah took a deep breath, clutched the Bible tightly, and read aloud. "The Lord is my refuge and my strength, a very present help in trouble." Her voice echoed in the small room, initially trembling, then gradually becoming firm. She felt the pressure lessen, as if the darkness was being pushed back step by step. When the clock struck 5 a.m., the air returned to normal, but Sarah knew this battle was not over. The next morning, she shared her experience with the prayer group. A quiet middle-aged man named Tom spoke up. "I felt something last night too. I'm not sure what it was, But when I prayed for my son, he's been struggling with alcohol. I heard a whisper in my head telling me he wasn't worth saving." Tom paused, his eyes red. "But I didn't give up. I prayed until dawn. And this morning, my son called, saying he wanted to go into rehab." The group fell silent. Sarah realized that the fourth hour wasn't just a time for prayer, it was a battleground, where they faced invisible forces trying to sow doubt and fear. But instead of panicking, they grew more determined. Sarah suggested that everyone bring their Bibles and write down their prayers, as a way to strengthen their faith and recognize how God responded. Everything came to a head one stormy night when a fierce storm swept through the town. The wind howled, trees were uprooted, and power was out over a wide area. The next morning, news spread. A small dam upstream was at risk of breaking, threatening to wash away the entire town. The townspeople panicked, but Sarah felt an unusual calm. She remembered the Bible verse she had read during the fourth hour. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." She called the prayer group to her house that night. By the flickering light of candles, they knelt down, holding hands, and prayed for God to protect the town. Sarah led, her voice rising above the sound of the thunder. "God, you are the ruler of nature. Please intervene, hold the dam steady, and grant us peace." Others joined in, praying for their families, homes, and even for those who didn't believe, who were trembling in the dark. By 5 a.m., the storm began to subside. An hour later, the news came. The dam held, though engineers couldn't explain why. The townspeople sighed in relief, but Sarah's group knew exactly what had happened. They didn't speak much, only silently giving thanks to God in their hearts. The news about that night spread throughout the town. Those who had once mocked the fourth hour began to grow curious. A week later, Sarah's house was no longer big enough for the prayer group. They had to move to the small church, where dozens of people gathered every morning. Some nights, the prayers rose like a hymn, cutting through the night, carrying hope and strength. Sarah no longer saw herself as the initiator. She felt like she was just a part of something bigger, a movement of watchmen rising up during the fourth hour to protect and intercede. One morning, she received a letter from John. He wrote, "Sarah, I don't know what you've done, but I feel different. I've started praying every morning, and for the first time in years, I feel I can forgive Dad." Sarah cried. She had never told John about the nights she prayed for him and their mother to reconcile with the past. But God had acted. Sarah's story spread beyond the town. One day, she was invited to a small conference in a neighboring city to share about the fourth hour. Standing before the crowd, she was nervous, but when she began to speak, the words flowed naturally. The fourth hour is not magic. It's an invitation to stand up, listen to God, and fight for those we love. I'm not special, but I've seen the power of persistence and faith. When she finished, the crowd applauded, but Sarah didn't need that. She only needed to know that someone, somewhere, would take hold of this flame and carry it on. After the stormy night, Sarah's small town was no longer the same. The muddy streets and the homes with holes in the roofs now had a strange beauty, the beauty of survival, of faith strengthened. The small church, where the fourth hour prayer group met, had now become the center of hope. Every early morning, while the sky was still misty, the sound of prayer echoed from voices no longer timid. Sarah often stood in the corner of the room, silently observing, her heart full of gratitude. She no longer felt like the leader, but just a part of something bigger, a movement she had unintentionally sparked. But not everyone was happy. One afternoon, while Sarah was organizing the shelves in Emily's store, Mr. Harris, an elderly man known for his conservative views, walked in. He looked at her with a cold gaze, his cane tapping on the floor. "I heard you're causing trouble at the church," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Praying at midnight, claiming God saved the damned. Stop making a fool of yourself, girl. That's human engineering, not a miracle." Sarah paused and took a deep breath. She had grown used to skepticism, but Mr. Harris' words still stung. "I didn't say it's a miracle, Mr. Harris," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm just saying we prayed, and God listened. I'm not forcing anyone to believe." Mr. Harris snorted and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he stopped, turned back, and said, "If you're right, prove it. My daughter Lucy is in the hospital, comatose for a month. If your God is that powerful, why doesn't he save her?" His words felt like a knife to Sarah's heart. She stood still, not knowing how to respond. That night, during the 4th hour, Sarah knelt, her heart heavy. She didn't pray for herself, but for Lucy, the 10-year-old girl she only knew through stories from the townspeople. "God," she whispered, "if this is your will, please heal Lucy, not for me, but for Mr. Harris, for all those who need to see you." She read her favorite Bible verse, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The words echoed through the room, like a promise in the darkness. The next day, news came like an unexpected breeze. Lucy had woken up, with no clear signs of injury. The doctors called it a medical miracle, but the prayer group members just smiled at each other. No explanation needed. Sarah visited the hospital with Tom and Mrs. Martha, bringing a small bouquet of flowers. When they entered the room, Mr. Harris was there, sitting by his daughter's bed, his eyes red. He looked at Sarah, saying nothing, but his gaze had changed, not cold, but curious and surprised. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah shook her head. "It wasn't me, Mr. Harris. I just prayed." "We all prayed." Mr. Harris didn't reply, but when Sarah left, she saw him take Lucy's hand, whispering something that she couldn't quite hear. She didn't need to hear it. She knew that a seed had been sown, no matter how small. The news of Lucy spread quickly, sparking a new wave of interest in the town. The church was now packed every early morning, not only with those who had been there before but also with new faces, those who had once doubted, who had mocked. Sarah began teaching others how to pray, find a quiet space, keep a respectful posture, and listen to God through the Bible. She encouraged them to keep a prayer journal, as she had done, to recognize the patterns in how God responds. But not always does God answer immediately. One night, when Sarah was praying for her mother who still kept her distance after years of arguments, she didn't feel anything but silence. No peace, no affirmation, only darkness and the sound of the wind. She closed the Bible, her heart heavy. "God, where are you?" she whispered. For the first time in weeks, she doubted herself. The silence lasted until the next morning, leaving Sarah exhausted. She came to the store with dark circles under her eyes, and Emily immediately noticed. "Are you okay?" her friend asked, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah sighed. "I'm not sure. I prayed for my mom, but nothing happened. Maybe I was wrong to think everything would be easy." Emily smiled, a rare, gentle smile. "Sarah, God doesn't always answer right away. Maybe he wants you to be patient. I don't believe in your prayers much, but I've seen you change. Don't give up." Emily's words were like a small light. Sarah nodded, deciding not to give up. That night, she knelt again during the 4th hour, not asking for anything big, just saying to God, "I leave my mom in your hands. Whatever you do, I believe you have a plan." This time, she didn't expect an immediate answer. She just sat there, listening, letting the silence be her companion. The next day, The doorbell at Sarah's house rang. She opened the door, surprised to see her mother standing there, holding a box of homemade cookies, something she hadn't brought since Sarah was a child. "I don't know why I suddenly wanted to come," she said, her voice hesitant. I'm sorry for the things that happened before." Sarah hugged her mother tightly, tears streaming down her face. She didn't tell her about the nights of prayer, but in her heart, she knew this was God's answer, not loud, not dramatic, but gentle like the early morning breeze. Reconciliation with her mother was a major turning point, but Sarah realized her mission didn't end with her family. The town was facing new problems, a flu outbreak spreading, making many people sick, including Tom. Sarah visited him, seeing him lying on the bed, coughing, but still weakly smiling. "Don't worry, girl," he said. "I believe the group will pray for me." That night, Sarah led the prayer group, focusing on Tom and the other sick people. They declared their faith through the Bible. "By his wounds, we are healed." Sarah felt a strange strength as everyone prayed in unison, as if their prayers were building an invisible barrier around the town. She pictured angels standing guard, pushing back the darkness of sickness. 3 days later, Tom called, his voice strong. "I don't have a cough anymore, Sarah. The doctor says I'm recovering unusually fast." Similar news came from other families. The flu gradually receded, leaving the town in surprise and gratitude. Sarah began to understand that the fourth hour was not just about asking, it was about building a spiritual barrier, not just for herself but for the entire community. She wrote in her prayer journal, "God is using us as intercessors. Every prayer is a brick, every moment of persistence is a wall." After the flu had receded, Sarah's small town seemed to enter an unusually peaceful season. The early mornings at the church were no longer just a place for prayer, but also a place where people shared miraculous stories. Mrs. Martha spoke about how she had found restful sleep after decades of insomnia. Tom, with his health restored, began attending the prayer group regularly, sharing the story of his son who had left rehab and was rebuilding his life. But what moved Sarah the most was the change in her mother. Mrs. Ellen, Sarah's mother, no longer wore a cold expression when talking about the past. One evening, she came to Sarah's house with an old photo album, sitting with her on the couch and recounting the difficult days when Sarah's father left. "I've been angry for so long," she said, her voice choking. "But these past few weeks, I felt lighter. I don't know why. It's as if someone took that burden off of me." Sarah smiled. Placing her hand on her mother's, she didn't tell her that she had been praying for her during the fourth hour, visualizing the chains of resentment breaking. She only whispered in her heart, "Thank you, God." This reconciliation was a gift greater than any miracles she had witnessed, for it healed a wound she thought would never heal. John, Sarah's brother, also began to change. After the phone call announcing that his debts were paid off, he started calling more often. Not just to chat, but to ask about the fourth hour. "What are you doing that makes everything get better?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Sarah laughed. "Try it and see. Wake up at 3 a.m., pray once, and see what happens." John grunted, but she knew he was thinking about it. One evening, John unexpectedly showed up at Sarah's door, carrying a small suitcase. "I've decided to stay for a few days," he said, his face slightly embarrassed. "Work is fine, but I need to find something." "You were right. Maybe I should try your strange hour." Sarah hugged him tightly, her heart filled with hope. She knew John wasn't easily swayed by spiritual matters, but his presence was a beginning. John attended the prayer group for the first time the following night. He sat in the corner of the room, holding the Bible Sarah gave him, looking awkward. When everyone began praying, he just sat silently, But by 4 a.m., he suddenly spoke up. "God, I'm not good at this. But if you're really here, please help me forgive. I'm tired of holding on to this pain." Sarah turned to him, surprised. She knew he was talking about their father, the one they had never forgiven. The atmosphere in the room seemed to change after John's prayer. A warm feeling spread through the space. And when the prayer session ended, he looked at Sarah with a new expression. "You know," he said, "I feel lighter." For the first time in years, Sarah held his hand, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't expected the fourth hour to touch him so quickly. But the peace didn't last. A week later, bad news struck. The largest lumber mill in town, where more than half the population worked, announced it was closing due to losses. Dozens of families fell into panic, including Tom's family. Sarah saw him sitting motionless in the church that morning, his head in his hands. "I just got back on my feet," he said, his voice hoarse. "And now this. How am I supposed to support my son?" Sarah didn't know how to respond. She looked around and saw the worried faces of the prayer group. Mrs. Martha took her hand and whispered, "Sarah, we need to do something. The fourth hour has saved us so many times." She nodded, but her heart was heavy. This wasn't a sickness or a storm, this was a real challenge, and she wasn't sure if prayer could solve it. That night, when the clock struck 3 a.m., Sarah led the prayer group with renewed determination. She stood in the middle of the room, her voice firm. "God, you know what this town needs. We're not just asking for jobs, but for your will to be done. If the mill closing is your will, please open a new path. We entrust everything into your hands." The others followed, praying for each family, each worker. John, for the first time, read aloud a Bible verse, "But seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you." When the prayer ended, no miracle happened immediately. But Sarah felt a strange peace, as if God was saying, "Trust me." The next day, the town was filled with a sense of gloom. People gathered in the square, talking about the job losses and the uncertain future. Sarah went with John to Emily's store, where her friend was trying to comfort some regular customers. "What do you think, Sarah?" Emily asked, her voice anxious. "Can prayer help this situation?" Before Sarah could respond, a strange truck pulled up in front of the store. A middle-aged man stepped out, introducing himself as Mr. Carter, a representative of a construction company from the big city. "I heard the lumber mill here is closing," he said. "Our company is looking for labor for a new project building a resort near the lake. I need to meet with the town leader to discuss." Sarah and Emily exchanged glances, unable to believe their ears. "Mr. Carter continued, "We need about 50 people immediately, and if everything goes well, we might expand." News spread quickly, and soon the whole town knew about this unexpected opportunity. Tom was one of the first to sign up, and he called Sarah later that afternoon. "Sarah, I've got work. I can't believe it." Sarah sat down after the call, tears rolling down her face. She remembered the prayer from the night before. "Please open a new path." This wasn't a coincidence, she was certain of it. When she shared this with the prayer group that evening, John spoke up. "I don't know how to say it, but I'm starting to believe. Maybe God is really listening to us." Double quotes. Mr. Carter's appearance marked a turning point. The new job not only saved the town from crisis, but also brought new hope. But Sarah knew that the fourth hour wasn't just about grand miracles, it was about the small changes in people's hearts. One morning, while she was writing in her prayer journal, John entered, holding a cup of coffee. "Sarah," he said, his voice hesitant, "I called Dad yesterday." Sarah stopped writing and looked up. "Really? What did you say?" "I told him I forgive him," John replied, his eyes red. "I don't know if he heard it." but I'm not angry anymore, thanks to you. Thanks to this hour. He pointed to the Bible on the table. Sarah hugged him, her heart full of gratitude. She realized she wasn't just the one praying, she was becoming the intercessor, connecting family, friends, and the entire town with God. That night, she wrote in her journal, "The fourth hour is a battleground, but it is also a door. Every prayer is a step forward, and every participant is a warrior." The small town slowly began to recover after Mr. Carter's appearance and the resort project. The streets, once quiet, were now bustling with the sounds of vehicles and laughter. Tom returned to work with a renewed sense of joy. John decided to stay longer to help Sarah with the prayer group, and Sarah's mother, Mrs. Ellen, even began attending a few early morning sessions. Though she still felt shy about reading the Bible, Sarah felt like everything was going in the right direction, as if the fourth hour had become the heartbeat of the community. But one afternoon, while Sarah was cleaning the church after a prayer session, the phone rang. It was Emily, her voice frantic. "Sarah, you need to get to the square right now. Something big has happened." Without asking further questions, Sarah quickly ran outside, her heart filled with unease. At the square, a crowd had gathered around Mr. Carter and the mayor. Mr. Carter, usually calm, looked tense, holding a thick folder in his hand. "I just received news from the company," he said, his voice deep. "A larger corporation, Grayson Enterprises, wants to buy the land around the lake to build a casino and shopping complex. They've offered double the price, and if we don't agree, they'll use the law to force us. Our resort project is at risk of being cancelled." Whispers spread through the crowd. Tom stepped forward, his face flushed. "Cancel? We've just started. They can't do that." But Mr. Carter shook his head. "They have the money and the power. If there's no solution, we'll lose." Sarah stood frozen, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet was shaking. The resort project wasn't just work, it was hope, a testament to the power of the fourth hour. If Grayson Enterprises succeeded, the town would not only lose jobs, but also be turned into a place alien to the values they had been building. She looked at John, seeing him clench his fists, his eyes full of worry. That night, the prayer group gathered with a heavy atmosphere. Sarah stood in the middle of the church, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on her face. "We've seen God move many times," she said, her voice firm despite the turmoil inside her. "Storms, flu epidemics, the mill closing, He has always made a way. Now, we're facing a new enemy, not spiritual darkness, but the greed of man. But I believe God is greater than all of that." Mrs. Martha nodded, gripping her cane. "Sarah is right. We must pray not just to save the project, but to protect this town." John, for the first time, read aloud, "The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble." The prayers rose, strong and unified, as if declaring war on the looming threat. The next day, representatives from Grayson Enterprises arrived in town. They were a group of well-dressed people, led by Mr. Grayson, a tall man with a sharp gaze. The meeting took place at the town hall, where Mr. Grayson presented his plan: a luxurious casino, a high-rise hotel, and a shopping center. "This is an opportunity for your town to develop," he said, his voice smooth. "We'll bring jobs, tourists, and money. Your resort project is nothing compared to the scope of our vision." But the people were not convinced. Tom stood up, his voice shaking. "You talk about jobs, but what you bring is gambling and debt. We don't need that." A murmur of agreement spread through the room, but Mr. Grayson just smiled dismissively. "You have no choice. We've already purchased most of the land around the lake. If you don't cooperate, we'll sue." Sarah sat in the back row, her heart burning with anger. She felt this was not just an economic battle, it was like a spiritual attack. an effort to break what the fourth hour had built. When the meeting ended, she pulled John and Tom aside. "We can't let them win," she said. "But not through arguing. We need to pray, really pray." That night, the fourth hour carried an unprecedented weight. The church was packed, not only with the regular group, but also with those who had once stood on the sidelines: Mr. Harris, Emily, and a few workers from the resort project. Sarah led, her voice resonating. "God, you see the greed threatening us. We don't ask for victory for ourselves, but for your will to be done. If this is not your path, show us the way. But if this is the land you've given us, please protect it." John continued, "May Mr. Grayson see something greater than money." Mrs. Allen, speaking for the first time in the group, prayed, "Grant us wisdom to know how to face this challenge." The prayers blended, not just as words, but as a spiritual wall surrounding the town. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Mr. Carter called Sarah, his voice excited. "You won't believe this. A group of investors from the city just contacted me. They heard about our resort project through a small article, and they want to invest expanding not just around the lake, but also in neighboring towns. They said this is the sustainable model they've been searching for." Sarah was stunned. "But what about Grayson?" "I don't know yet," Mr. Carter replied, "but with this money, we can fight them." "Do you think this is a coincidence?" Sarah smiled. "No, I don't think so." She shared the news with the prayer group that evening, and the entire room erupted in cheers. But the joy was interrupted when the latest news arrived. Grayson Enterprises had filed a lawsuit requesting the local government to seize the land around the lake for public interest. The battle was far from over. That night, as Sarah knelt during the fourth hour, she felt a powerful presence. No words, no images, just a feeling of certainty that God was at work. She wrote in her journal, "He doesn't promise everything will be easy, but He promises to be with us. I believe He is building something greater than we can see." The trial took place 2 weeks later in a nearby city. Sarah, John, Tom, and a few others represented the town. Grayson Enterprises presented a series of documents, land purchase contracts, permits, and promises of economic benefits. Mr. Carter's lawyer counter, emphasizing the cultural and environmental value of the resort project, but it was clear that Grayson's side had the advantage. The night before the verdict, the prayer group held a special session at the church. They didn't ask for victory, but for God's will to be revealed. Sarah read aloud, "Let our faith be greater than our fear." At 5 a.m., a strong wind blew through, shaking the window frames as if nature itself was joining in. The next morning, in the courtroom, the unexpected happened. Mr. Grayson suddenly stood up, cutting off his own lawyer. "I'm withdrawing the lawsuit," he said, his voice deep but clear. The judge was surprised. "Are you sure?" Mr. Grayson nodded, without explanation, and left the room with a puzzled expression. Later, through a mutual acquaintance, Sarah learned that the night before, Mr. Grayson had dreamed of a brilliant light and a voice telling him to stop. He didn't believe in God, but the dream terrified him. Sarah didn't know if that was the truth, but she knew what had happened during the fourth hour. The resort project was saved, and the town celebrated with a grand ceremony by the lake. Sarah stood watching the people, her heart full of gratitude. She whispered, "Thank you, God, for making us your watchman." The victory over Grayson Enterprises not only saved the resort project, but also completely changed the way the townspeople viewed the fourth hour. The small church was no longer big enough for the early morning prayer sessions. They had to open more doors, add extra seats, and even let some people stand outside, in the misty morning air. Sarah often stood in the corner, observing the familiar and unfamiliar faces, her heart full of gratitude and wonder. She had never imagined that such a simple decision, waking up at 3 a.m. to pray, could lead to this. After the ceremony by the lake, the town held a small festival to give thanks. Tom brought his family, including his son, who had just returned from rehab, now healthy and starting work on the project. Mrs. Martha, with stronger legs than ever, stood handing out cakes to children. John and Mrs. Allen set up a small booth, selling coffee and chatting with everyone. Sarah watched her family together in peace, her heart light as if a final burden had been lifted. But what moved her the most was when Mr. Harris approached. He didn't say much, only placed his hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You were right, Sarah, I was wrong." Then he turned back to play with Lucy, who was now running around as if she had never been comatose. Sarah smiled, not needing him to say more. His gaze spoke louder than any words. That night, during the 4th hour, Sarah led the prayer group with a different spirit. She didn't ask for anything big, only to give thanks. God, you have done more than we dared dream. Thank you for making us intercessors, watchmen for each other. When everyone said Amen in unison, she felt the cool breeze sweep through the church, like a confirmation from above. News of the small town spread through stories shared by workers on the project and visitors to the newly opened resort. One day, Sarah received a letter from a pastor 2 hours away in the city. He wrote, "I've heard about your 4th hour and the miracles happening in your town. We are facing many problems, crime, poverty, division. Could you come and share with us?" Sarah was astonished. She wasn't a speaker, nor a leader. She was just an ordinary person who had found strength in prayer. But John, sitting next to her as she read the letter, patted her shoulder. "You can do it. I saw you in court, in the church. You have something people need to hear." After days of thinking and praying, Sarah agreed. She brought Tom and Emily, who had now become an active member of the prayer group, to the city. At a church much larger than the one she was used to, Sarah stood before hundreds of people, her heart pounding. She shared her story, from the nights of doubt, the strange dreams, to how the 4th hour changed the town. "It's not an instant miracle," she said, her voice trembling but growing more confident. "It's persistence, it's believing that God hears us, even when we don't see immediate results." The crowd listened in silence, then erupted in applause when she finished. After the talk, many people approached her, asking for advice on how to start a 4th hour in their own communities. A young woman, eyes red from crying, whispered, "My husband left last week. I'm going to try praying like you." Sarah hugged her, filled with hope that the 4th hour would spread further than she ever imagined. On the way back, Sarah realized her mission was not just to lead others, but to continue growing within herself. One night, when she knelt in the 4th hour, she opened her heart to God about her deepest fears: fear of failure, fear of not being strong enough to carry the role everyone expected of her. "I'm not as strong as they think," she said. "Please guide me." In response, she felt a deep peace, accompanied by a Bible verse that appeared in her mind. "My power is made perfect in weakness." Sarah wrote the verse in her journal, realizing that the strength of the 4th hour wasn't in her, but in God, the one who uses imperfect people like her to do great things. John also continued his journey. He started leading a small prayer group in the town, focusing on the men who had lost their faith, just as he had. One morning, he told Sarah, "Yesterday, someone in the group said he found a job after 3 years of unemployment. You know, I'm starting to understand why you've been so persistent." Mrs. Ellen, though slower, also changed. She not only joined the prayer group but also began helping those in need in the town, bringing food to the sick, talking to the lonely. "I'm not as good at praying as you," she told Sarah once, "but I feel happy doing something for others." Sarah smiled, knowing that the fourth hour wasn't just about words, but also actions. A year after the victory over Grayson Enterprises, the resort by the lake was completed, becoming a symbol of unity and faith. But what made Sarah even prouder was how the fourth hour had spread. She received letters from all over, from neighboring towns, from big cities, even a letter from abroad, where a small group had started praying after hearing her story on the radio. Sarah's town was now not just a place to live. It was a spiritual lighthouse. One night, when the prayer group gathered, Sarah suggested, "Let's pray for the world out there. Not just for us, but for those who need the light." They all agreed, and their prayers rose, no longer confined to the walls of the church, but like an invisible wave spreading everywhere. That night, Sarah wrote in her journal, "The fourth hour is a barrier of protection, not just for us, but for anyone willing to stand up. I don't know how far it will go, but I trust that God will lead the way." Sarah's story didn't end like a fairy tale ending, but like a new beginning. One early morning, as she stood by the lake watching the sunrise, she felt a familiar presence. No words, just a sense that God was smiling. She was no longer the timid woman who feared the dark. She was a watchman, an intercessor, and above all, a believer. John now led his own prayer group, sharing his story with those who needed to hear it. Mrs. Ellen became the mother of the whole town, using love to heal wounds that words could not reach. Tom, Emily, Mrs. Martha, Mr. Harris, each person carried a part of the fourth hour within them, spreading it in their own way. Sarah returned to the church, where the group still gather every early morning. She took the Bible in her hands and read aloud, "Watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation." The words echoed, not just as a reminder, but as an invitation, for her, for the town, and for anyone who heard. When the clock struck 5 a.m., Sarah looked up, seeing the bright sunrise through the window. She smiled, knowing that the fourth hour would never truly end. It would live on in the hearts of those willing to listen to the whispers from heaven. Time passed like a quiet river, carrying with it changes that Sarah had never expected. 2 years since Grayson Enterprises withdrew their lawsuit, the small town was no longer the forgotten, remote place it once was. The lakeside resort had become a peaceful destination, attracting those seeking calm amid the nosy world. But for Sarah, the most precious thing was not the new roads or the beautiful houses, but the hearts touched by the fourth hour. The small church now had a simple yet radiant beauty, with new stained glass windows donated by the community. Every early morning, when the clock struck 3 o'clock, the flickering candles still illuminated the sacred space, and the prayers rose, tireless and unceasing. Sarah no longer led the group every day. She had handed that role to John, Tom, and others who had found strength within themselves, but she still knelt at the back row, listening, feeling, and being grateful. One cold winter afternoon, as snow gently covered the church roof, Sarah received another letter, this time from a distant village in the mountains. The letter was from a young girl named Anna, who said she had heard about the fourth hour from a visitor from Sarah's town. "Our village is dying," Anna wrote, her handwriting trembling. "The crops have failed, the young people have left, and only the elderly and despair remain. I've started praying at 3 a.m., but I don't know if I'm doing it right. Sarah, please help me." Sarah sat quietly, gripping the letter. She saw herself from 2 years ago, a lost woman, filled with doubt, yet guided by an invisible call. She smiled, took pen and paper, and wrote back, "Dear Anna, you don't need to do it right, just do it with all your heart. The fourth hour is not a formula, it's an invitation for you to rise, listen, and believe. You are not alone, we will pray with you." That night, Sarah brought the letter to the prayer group. She read each line aloud, and when she finished, the whole room responded in unison. "We pray for Anna, for her village, that you may make a way for them, just as you have for us." Sarah felt a warm wave spread through the room, as if their prayers had crossed the mountains, reaching the young girl they had never met. The following spring, Sarah decided to make a journey, not to speak or lead, but to meet Anna and her village. John and Emily insisted on coming along, and Mrs. Ellen, though older, joined them with a beaming smile. "I want to meet that girl," she said, "and bring her some cakes." The journey to the mountain village was not easy. The roads were rugged, the air bitterly cold, but Sarah felt a strange strength guiding her. When they arrived, the village appeared before them, a few rundown wooden houses, barren fields, and faces hardened by hardship. Anna, a petite girl with bright eyes, ran to greet them, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe you're really here," she said, hugging Sarah tightly. That night, Sarah and the group held a fourth-hour prayer right in the middle of the village, under the starry sky. The villagers gathered, hesitant at first, but as Sarah began telling her story, from lonely nights to the miracles in the town, they listened with eyes filled with hope. John read from the Bible. "Those who sow in tares will reap in joy." Emily sang a hymn, her voice echoing through the valley, and Mrs. Ellen, with her simplicity, handed out cakes to everyone, whispering, "God is here, my children." When the clock struck 5 a.m., an elderly man in the village stood up, his voice trembling. "I haven't believed in God since my wife passed. But tonight, I feel like she's smiling." Anna held Sarah's hand, whispering, "Do you see? It's beginning." Sarah nodded, tears rolling down her face. She knew that the fourth hour didn't need her to exist. It was a living fire, spreading from one heart to another, crossing all boundaries. Returning to the town, Sarah felt a deep peace. She no longer worried about the future of the fourth hour. It had gone beyond her reach, becoming a part of those willing to hear the call. One early morning, as she knelt in the church, she opened her journal and wrote the final line, "The fourth hour is not mine. It is yours, and for all who dare to rise in the darkness to find the light." That day, the town received news from Anna. A small group of investors had arrived in her village, bringing seeds and machinery to restore the fields. The villagers called it the spring miracle, but Anna wrote to Sarah, "I know it's because of the fourth hour. I will continue, Sarah, just as you have." Sarah folded the letter and walked out to the lake. The still waters mirrored the blue sky, and she felt a familiar presence. No words, just a gentle breath from God. She smiled, whispering, "Thank you, God, for choosing me. Not because I am strong, but because you are strong through me." John was now steady leader, bringing the fourth hour to men who had once lost hope. He had met with his father once, not to reconcile fully, but to say the words of forgiveness, and that was enough. Mrs. Ellen had become the spiritual mother of the town, always ready with a hug and a prayer. Tom and his son worked by the lake, building not only the resort but also a new family. Emily, once skeptical, now sang hymns every morning, her voice like a breeze carrying hope far and wide. But the story didn't stop with them. From the small town, the fourth hour spread to distant places, poor villages, nosy cities, lonely homes in the dark. Everywhere it went, a light was lit, a heart healed, a community built. Sarah would never know all those stories, but she didn't need to. She believed that every prayer in the fourth hour was a brick, building an invisible kingdom that only God could see in its entirety. Many years later, when Sarah's hair had turned silver, she still knelt in the church every early morning. Though her legs were no longer as swift, the prayer group was now led by the young people, but they always invited her to share, not as a leader, but as a witness to the early days. One night, when the snow fell again, she shared her story one last time. Her voice weak but clear. The fourth hour is not about us. It is about Him. The one who hears the whispers in the night. The one who turns fear into faith. The one who uses trembling hands to hold the torch and light the way. When she finished, a young girl, Tom's granddaughter, stood up, her eyes shining. "I will continue, Grandma Sarah. I want to bring it to school, to my friends." Sarah smiled, placing her hand on the girl's head. "You don't need to take it anywhere," she said. "Just light it right where you stand." That night, Sarah lay down in bed, her heart at peace. She closed her eyes, and in her final dream, she saw a field of light, thousands of flickering candles, stretching endlessly, each one a prayer, a life touched by the fourth hour. She heard a gentle whisper, "You've done well," and she knew that was the moment she was going home. But the fourth hour did not end with Sarah. It lived on in those who remained, in John, in Anna, in Tom's granddaughter, and in the millions of hearts who never knew her name. It was the light in the dark, the eternal whisper, the proof that when people rise in the darkness to seek God, He will always answer.